The threat of a Russian invasion of Ukraine intensifies by the day, so will it be war or diplomacy moving forward? John Blaxland is a Professor of International Security and Intelligence Studies at the Australian National University and joins me now for more on this. Professor, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Good to be with you, Holly.
Now, do you think that Ukrainian officials here are underselling the threat, or are Western officials overselling the threat of a Russian invasion?
Yeah, it's hard to gauge exactly because Vladimir Putin has deployed forces along the Ukrainian border, not dissimilar in size to the forces that the United States deployed along the Iraqi border back in 2003. So the idea that it's not enough troops for an invasion, it does depend on how you want to look at it, but certainly it's enough troops to conduct a series of raids up to and possibly including full-scale invasion, which my sense is essentially this is about intimidation, about getting concessions from Ukraine, from the United States, from NATO, without having to revert to military force directly, kinetically. Now, whether we're seeing, though, the pushback, the surprising level of pushback, I think has caught Putin a little bit by surprise. I think the failure in Afghanistan and elsewhere led him to believe that Biden was a bit of a pushover, that the United States was so consumed with its own domestic problems and NATO so divided with fresh leadership that's sceptical of American leadership and keen to maintain Russian gas supplies would preclude this kind of situation he's now facing. So I think Putin's in a bit of a corner now, in a difficult predicament, and that in that difficult predicament, we may see him lash out violently, and that's, of course, the grave danger that we face.
Ukraine, better than anyone, understands it isn't joining NATO anytime soon. Putin knows perfectly well that membership is not around the corner. So are these false conditions that Russia is trying to bring here to justify their aggression on the border?
Look, yes and no, but I think this is more than just about Ukraine. This is about the position, the attitude of former Soviet aligned countries, the Warsaw Pact countries that are now part of NATO, that are ones that Vladimir Putin's been essentially trying to get greater concessions out of, trying to get them, the United States and NATO broadly, to wind back the clock. So Ukraine is the litmus test, but it's not the only factor at play here. And of course, we've seen Vladimir Putin talk about Rusland, the great medieval Russia. Of course, very cherry-picking view of history and the place of Russia and the relationship with Ukraine. That denies their own separate history and their own choices in the matter as democratically elected governments and people who get to have their own choice. The use of force to extract these kind of concessions speaks to a thuggery of which we've seen now repeatedly in various theatres, not just in eastern Ukraine and Crimea, but in Georgia, in the Baltics and elsewhere as well.
From a national strategic point of view, Ukraine does nothing for the United States. So why is the United States and the West putting itself on the line here with one of the biggest superpowers in the entire world for Ukraine?
Yeah, no, I think it's a real challenge. A lot of people are now starting to see this in terms of the kind of concessions that were made in the mid to late 1930s towards the fascists that emboldened them to take further steps. And there is a perception out there that were these concessions to be made to Putin over Ukraine and over NATO, that this would embolden him, give him confidence that he could push further, he make greater demands. There's been no indication from Putin that it is thus far and no further. He has been the master of Maskirovka, of deception operations, of pretending to be unaware of developments, and this is what we saw in 2014 in Donbass and Crimea. And we know that he is masterful at deception. We know he's got a degree of insecurity domestically in his own political situation and a overinflated sense of his own importance and of this centrality of Russia to Eurasian politics. And the combination would suggest that unless there is resistance offered here diplomatically, economically, with sanctions and other things, that he would therefore use that as a goading to go further, confident that the West, NATO, the United States and others, including countries like Australia, would offer no pushback. That's the rub point. That's the point of great concern. That's the point at which we're now at the stage of, do we make concessions or not? Will the concessions goad him? Will they encourage him to be more adventurous in the future? And that seems to be the growing consensus at the moment.
The West doesn't want to be in a situation here where Russia can determine who gets to be a NATO member or not. But does Putin have the right here to be concerned about NATO's build-up?
Yeah, look, NATO has encroached on the former Soviet territories in a way that is, when you're as conspiratorial as Vladimir Putin and when you rule Russia the way he rules, he sees everything in these Manichaean terms. Now, of course, these countries that have joined NATO have done so because they've wanted to join NATO. That's because they're afraid of Russia. They're afraid of Vladimir Putin. This is, let's not forget that 20 years ago, Russia was in a position where there was contemplation given to the prospect of Russia itself becoming part of NATO. That is a long way away now, of course, but a lot of that's got to do with Vladimir Putin's own actions, not just Putin's actions, admittedly. The United States and NATO and other countries, its actions over Iraq, over Kosovo and over Libya have all contributed to an erosion of Russian sense of partnership with the West. And of ability, confidence that they can work with them. So it's not all on, there's blame to be cast around on a number of fronts. And let's not forget, Ukraine is not a paragon of virtue itself. It's got its own faults, its own problems, its own crony behaviour, and so on. That all aside, we're still seeing an incredibly arrogant approach to the use of power and to the authority of one country over another. And that's what's, I think, galling and most worrying about, this sense of the international order being challenged by what Putin's doing here. This is a ugly reversion to a style that we thought had gone out of vogue mid-last century. It's clearly not. It's back in fashion. And the question is, do we push back or do we let it happen and do we let it accelerate?
Professor, the biggest question here for me is that if Russian President Vladimir Putin wanted to invade Ukraine, would we have this much warning? Because at the moment, everyone's sitting in limbo. No one knows which way it's swaying. We don't know whether it's swaying towards war or diplomacy. Would Russian President Vladimir Putin give this much warning? If he wanted to invade Ukraine, wouldn't he just go ahead and do it?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, Holly. The thing is, though, that unlike in 2014, when he was really actively trying to pretend that he wasn't involved in trying to seize the Donbass, with the little green men having taken all their insignia off their uniforms, this time around they're not trying that, in part because what they're trying to do is a bit more ambitious. And if you could recall, I think the parallel I just mentioned about the Iraq War in 2003, the United States and its coalition was not at all hiding its intentions to invade Iraq. The question was whether or not they were going to persuade Saddam Hussein to cave without having to revert to force. Now, we're in a similar predicament. To actually deploy an invading force, you need to build it up. And probably the decision was made, well, you can either try and hide it or use it to your advantage. And clearly, in this case, they are using it to their advantage to intimidate, to scare, while they go through drills, while they build up their force, while they get the additional enabling capabilities, hospitals, ammunition resupply, fuel resupply, stocks and equipment to sustain an operation, while at the same time preparing to launch the range of cyber disturbance, direct interference, political interference, and espionage and sabotage operations that is now becoming quite commonly discussed in a way that I think is a little unsettling to Vladimir Putin, because the Maskirovka, if you like, the campaign of deception, is the mask is off. People can see right through the facade. They can see the tactics being deployed. They can see the obfuscation and the smokescreen of purported diplomacy. We've seen that here in Canberra, with the Russian ambassador, talking about how it's all someone else's fault. Look like this, going, it's not us, we're not the problem. I think, okay, that's one way of looking at it. There you go.
Professor John Blaxland, thank you for your insight today. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me on the show, Holly.